Good morning. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce this session on pathways in crime and their explanation. We have two presentations based on the PADS Plus longitudinal study and one on the Chicago study. The first presentation is by Kyle Treiber about pathways in crime and the drivers. The second one is by Gabriela Roman, talking about emergency selection, explaining changes in young people's crime propensities in criminogenic exposure. And then we top with the presentation of Rob Sampson on pathways to crime and criminalization in the lives of Chicago children. I think this is going to be a very exciting session, so please allow me to first introduce Kyle Treiber, who's going to do the first one. Can I also say that the presenters have about 25 minutes each for the presentation, and then if you have questions, we can take them after, sort of 5 minutes after each presentation. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Kyle Treiber. I work at the University of Cambridge, and I'm Deputy Director of the Peterborough Adolescent and Young Adult Development Study, which you may know as PADS Plus. And today I'm going to be looking specifically at some of our data and trying to explore the pathways in crime that we see within our sample and to what extent we may be able to explain this by the pathways we see in those same young people's patterns of crime propensity and criminogenic exposure. PADS Plus is designed to test the situational action theory, and at the core of the situational action theory is what we call the PEA model, which is the interaction between individuals' characteristics and experiences with the environmental features that they encounter. And this interaction then leads them to perceive and choose different alternatives for action. Of course, in our case, we're interested in whether or not they see crime as an alternative and choose to pursue that. So we're interested in trying to identify the personal characteristics and experiences and the environmental features that are going to be relevant to that perception choice process. And there's already been a lot of work done on this front, a lot of evidence coming both from our study but also from replication studies, including those in Sweden, and also from cross-national comparative studies, which are supporting that the key factors of propensity and the key environmental features that we've identified in SAT are indeed quite strong predictors of this crime involvement. So those predictors are, as you may be familiar, individuals' personal morality, which is a combination of the rules of conduct that people accept and follow, and their moral beliefs, their moral emotions, so the emotions that support that, particularly shame and guilt. And we're also, of course, interested in the ability to exercise self-control, which is related to the ability to actually act in accordance with those moral rules when you might be tempted to do otherwise. And we see self-control as a bit different than it's often seen in criminology. So it is conditional on whether or not people would see crime as an option and have something, therefore, to control. On the other side, then, for exposure, we've identified the moral context is really the aspect of an environment that is influencing a person's action, and particularly, again, that perception and choice of crime as an option. And there we're interested in what kind of motivators are present in a setting, and then what kinds of rules are relevant in that setting, what the social norms are, and the extent to which they may be enforced if an individual is perceiving crime as something they might do in those settings. Now, one thing about SAT is it's not just about this situational model. It's not just attempting to explain what happens at the point of action and the key mechanism, perception and choice at that point, but also it goes beyond this to look at the precursor processes, which we talk about the developmental processes. And this is the DEA model, or the developmental ecological action model of SAT. And here we try to identify the processes that might be involved in the development of propensities. Here we talk about psychosocial processes, particularly moral education and cognitive nurturing. And then we also are interested in the processes that bring people into contact with particular contexts. And these are the socio-ecological processes of selection, particularly self and social selection. And that's important for understanding the convergence between people who've developed these crime propensities and then contexts which have acquired these criminogenic features. The main proposition of this developmental ecological action model is that to understand changes in people's crime involvement, we need to understand the changes in their propensity and exposure, because those changes in crime involvement are being driven by changes in the nature and frequency of criminogenic interaction. So the interaction between people and their crime propensities and those environments with their criminogenic features. And we can see the changes in people's propensity and their exposure over time, and that, of course, is what is going to determine those interactions. So this has a number of key testable implications, but the one that I'm going to be looking at today is simply that differences then in patterns of young people's crime involvement may be explained then by looking at the patterns of their change in these crime propensities and in criminogenic exposure. So this is the research design for the PAD study. You may be familiar with it, but I'll just highlight a few things for you. It's an ongoing longitudinal study. We've just finished our 8th wave of data collection from the young people in December. We had a 91% retention rate at that point, so over the last 12 years, which we're very pleased with. We did a parents wave as well initially, where we got retrospective data on the young people. So the young people were first interviewed when they were turning 13. It's a representative sample of young people from the UK city of Peterborough. There were originally 716 young people in the sample, and like I said, we still have 91% taking part at age 24. We have a number of instruments, which I'll talk about in just a moment, looking at these young people, their experiences, their personal characteristics, of course, but also understanding their exposure to different environments. And to get more information about those environments, we've also conducted 2 community surveys. So we did one in 2005 and one again in 2012. And this is to get a very comprehensive look at the social environments of the city of Peterborough, where they're spending their time. And we do a lot on the work of Rob Sampson on econometrics and methods for trying to assess things like social cohesion and informal social control and collective efficacy, which is the variable I'll be using today. I'll also point out that in the last wave, we've also collected saliva samples, and those are currently being analyzed, so we also are going to have a biosocial element to look at in future. So, to look at an interaction, to be able to understand how personal characteristics and environmental features come together to predict and potentially explain action, of course we need to have data from both individuals and environments. And as I mentioned, we have lots of different methods. For personal characteristics, we use predominantly an interviewer-led questionnaire, and the data I'll be looking at today, quite a lot of that draws from this questionnaire. We also have a number of cognitive measures that I mentioned as well, the genetics data. Then on the side of the environment, we have this small area community survey. We also have official data, census and land use data. Some of that will be pulled in as well today. And then we have the space-time budget, which is really our most innovative method. And it's particularly important for understanding exposure, although it does provide a useful measure as well of environmental features. And that involves a time diary. We ask young people at every interview about 4 days in the previous week. And for each hour of those days, we ask them who they were with, what they were doing, what their main activity was, and where they were functionally and geographically. So we can then link that data spatially to the census data and the community survey data. And of course, at the same time, we also ask them, were they involved in any acts of crime? We have other data like substance use. One of our colleagues presented on that recently, and also victimization. But today, we'll only be interested in the crime. In fact, I won't even be using the space-time budget crime data, but we have lots of other crime data to look at. So we have the self-report traditional methods, which is what I'll focus on today. And then we also have official records from the police national computer. So we've got lots of different things to work with here to try to explore SAT and the many testable implications that it has. And as I said earlier, there's already been a lot of work at the situational level that's been quite successful and supportive of SAT. That's both within our research group, but also independent researchers and collaborators that we work with. Now we're trying to look more at the developmental model, and that is what we're looking at today. So very quickly on the methods, because there are quite a lot of variables that go in to these analyses. The first is the crime propensity, and as I mentioned earlier, the key elements of crime propensity according to SAT are the personal moral rules and the ability to exercise self-control. So personal morality and self-control are measured using questionnaire scales. For morality, this is items about how wrong the young people think it is to commit different kinds of rule breaking, from very minor acts to very serious. It's a 16-item scale. And we use an additive scale for that. Similarly, this ability to exercise self-control is measured using 8 items, which are designed to try to tap into the general use of self-control. And as I mentioned, SAT's idea of self-control is a bit different than the idea of a latent characteristic or personality characteristic. It's actually situational, so we're trying to tap into that. But here we're looking at really to what extent do the young people demonstrate that they can exercise self-control. So that's traditional items like I don't tend to think before I act. I don't think about the future. People better watch out if I'm angry, that sort of thing. Then we have our criminogenic exposure measure, which is a bit more unusual or complex. This is taken from the space-time budget effectively. It's the number of hours that the young people spend unsupervised with their peers when they're outside of school and work contexts. And that's qualified by the fact that those hours have to be spent in areas with poor collective efficacy, which is measured from the community survey, or when they're in a city or local center, which is measured from the land use databases. And that's because we know collective efficacy is not as effective of a measure of the moral context within the city centers, because it's a measure of residents' collective efficacy. And in the city and local centers, there are many more types of people using those settings, visitors moving in and out. We also qualify this with a measure from the questionnaire scale, looking at young people's, the extent of their peers' crime involvement. And that's because young people are spending time with crime-averse peers that may, of course, not be criminogenic and may be anti-criminogenic. So we want to try to identify the hours in which the moral context is going to be weak, and that will be when they're spending time with crime-prone peers under these conditions. And finally, we have our outcome variable, which is the acts of crime. And I mentioned this is a self-reported measure. We're using both prevalence and frequency in our analyses. And it's 9 different crime types, which are your traditional classic young people's crimes. We do have a lot of additional crime types, including sexual offending, partner violence, fraud, driving offenses, and so forth. But I won't include those because they are some of them, for one thing, have not been measured at all time points, but they are different, and they have a lot of implications for including them at this point. Now, when we think about patterns of crime involvement over time, of course, the first thing we're going to think about is the classic age crime curve. We're all familiar with this. It's often presented either, in this case, as a number of crimes reported at each age. This is our self-report for our participants. Or it can be reported as prevalence of offenders at each age, which I'll show you in a minute. And we know that this has been replicated across many different countries, many different populations within those countries, many different crime types. And although there are differences, of course, that are there are quite consistent patterns in the fact that we see increases generally during the beginning and middle of adolescence, and then decreases towards the end of adolescence or into the 20s. But we also know this is not reflective of all young people's patterns of crime involvement, because we know, as I mentioned, that we have these patterns when we look at prevalence. But if we start to look at things like frequency, we can see that the patterns are quite different. For those young people who are offending, say during adolescence, we find in our sample the frequency of offending is actually peaking at 17. So those people who are offending later are offending more. And it's a combination of these patterns of prevalence and frequency that give us this ultimate age crime curve. So there's been a lot of exploration in the last few decades trying to look further at this and understand better about individual differences and patterns that we see within these patterns of crime involvement. And that's where we come to trajectory analyses. So we've run a growth mixture model looking at our sample and their patterns of crime involvement here from ages 13 to 24. And from that, we found that the 3 trajectory model is the best fit and is quite consistent with what you may have seen from other studies. So one of the things that we definitely find is we have a very large group that are involved in essentially no crime or only very occasional crime throughout this entire period. And that actually represents, as you see, almost 85% of our sample. So that's the vast majority of the young people in our sample are not involved in much crime. Then we have an adolescence limited trajectory. So these young people do start offending, but they peak quite early. And then actually by the age of 19, they're indistinguishable in their crime patterns. In fact, they don't report any crime from that point on. So they're in line with those no offending or occasional offending young people. And then we have our persistent offending trajectory, if you will, although perhaps we should be calling them life course to sisters here, because you can see they aren't persisting throughout this entire time period, but they do have a much longer involvement in crime than the other young people in the sample. And this trajectory, as you can see, is peaking later and much steeper. And that's only about 6% of the sample. Again, these patterns of crime involvement, the adolescence limited, the persistent, these are quite consistent, again, with what other studies have found. Some of the things that aren't always pointed out in those studies, though, are the fact that, again, 84% of our young people are not offending. So there's often an assumption when we look at young people's crime that this is normal. Crime is something that all young people do and something that we should accept that they will do and that they're going to grow out of it and so forth. But actually it's not at all normal within our sample. Most of them are not offending. Another interesting thing is these adolescent limited offenders. In our sample, they're quite difficult to distinguish up until age 15 from the more persistent offenders. So that's interesting. What is it that's different about those people, or what is it that's happening at age 15 that's leading to those differences? And that could, of course, have implications for prevention. And then we see, of course, again, those adolescents limited then coinciding with the no or low offenders. So that's interesting to think as well. What's brought them back onto that type of pathway? So that's our next question, is how do we try to explain these patterns of crime involvement? And I've suggested we want to try to do this by using propensity and exposure. So the next thing we did was looked at gross mixture modeling with a propensity variable, which again is a combination of moral rules and the ability to exercise self-control. So first off, you can see from the autoaggressive model there is stability in propensity across all the time points. It's actually quite stable propensity, and that's again consistent with what we know about individual level characteristics. They tend to be quite stable over time. But if you look at the latent growth curve model and the growth mixture models, there are changes over time that we see on the aggregate level, and then also individual differences or individual patterns that emerge. So one thing that is certainly standing out there is the fact that we have an increase in early adolescence, we have a peak, and this is true for all of the trajectories at age 16, and then we have a reduction in propensity after that. We have, again, a three-solution model, or three-model solution, rather, and those trajectories are quite similar. They're all piecewise trajectories, I should say. And what we see, the difference is really, one, the level of the propensity, and also the fact that in the higher propensity pathways, we have a bit of a steeper peak. So it's interesting to think about what might be happening at age 16 there. Certainly in the UK, we have that being the age at which young people can leave compulsory education, where there's lots of life changes that are happening at that time period. So certainly an interesting thing for us to be thinking about in further analysis, some of which Gabriela will be talking about later. We then look at our exposure. Again, in the autoaggressive model, we do have stability. It's not quite as strong over time as we saw in the propensity model. And again, we might expect that would be the case. We know that people's patterns of activities and their access to settings changes quite dramatically over adolescence. And you can see later on through the study that relationship or that stability is weaker, but it's still very much there. And we get a very similar pattern again with our piecewise models that we did with the propensity trajectories. In this case, we really have a two-part model that's the best fit. And we have a similar pattern with a high and a low level, and then again a steeper peak with the high level. But again, we see that age 16 coming out as an interesting time point. All right, so if we have these patterns, then the next thing we want to do is try to understand whether or not these patterns are related in any way to what we see in the young people's crime involvement. So we had our three trajectories of crime. So here we're looking at the probability of the young person following one of these trajectories of crime. If we look first at the role of propensity, we see that individuals who are more likely to follow the high propensity or the medium propensity pathway are more likely to also follow the persistent crime pathway. The medium propensity relationship is a little bit weaker there, but it is still there. So the higher your propensity, the more likely, the higher your trajectory, or pathway propensity rather, the more likely you are to follow that persistent crime pathway. Of course, we've argued in SAT it's not just about propensity, and indeed if we then look at the probability of the young people following that high exposure pathway, we also see that that will predict their probability of following the persistent crime pathway. And it's quite a strong relationship as well. Now if we look at the adolescence limited pathway, again we find that propensity is predicting. So whether you're on the medium propensity or the high propensity pathway, you are more likely to follow this adolescence limited pathway. But what we don't find is the relationship between which pathway you are following in exposure and following that adolescence limited pathway. And this is perhaps unexpected if we think about many of the explanations of adolescence limited offending, which suggests that during adolescence, some young people will be exposed to contexts which lead them to offend, but then over time they grow out of those contexts or they find ways of accessing those contexts, say, for example, sexual activities, drug use, jobs. So once there's legitimate access and legitimate opportunities to emerge, then they stop offending. And that doesn't, in our sample, look to be what may be going on. It looks more like these individuals do have a crime propensity, but they're not having that expressed. So they're not in the context where it's being expressed. But their offending is then being driven more by their individual characteristics than their exposure. And the fact that they stop offending may be because of that lack of exposure. So lots to explore further there, of course, but it certainly raises questions about how we explain these relationships. Okay, so what are the implications? What do we take away from these findings? Well, the first thing is one I mentioned earlier, which is the fact that in our sample, and if you look at a lot of other data out there, crime is not a normal part of growing up, and we should not approach it as if it is. This is something that is characterizing a certain group of young people. So then we want to understand why are some young people becoming involved in crime. And of course, the next question is, what can we do about that? Another big implication is that people matter. We cannot ignore these individual characteristics. From these particular findings, propensity is very clearly indicated in both patterns of crime involvement, whether it's persistent or the adolescence limited patterns. And the exposure is not implicated in both. So people are important. And places are also important. So for those persistent offenders, they were more likely to be persistent offenders if they followed the high propensity trajectories and the high exposure trajectories. So this is very supportive of SAT's argument that it's all about people and places, and therefore all about interactions. So this begins to help us answer questions about what is it that we need to be looking at, and that is encompassing both the idea of who, people with what characteristics, and where. So we know there are lots and lots of risk factors that are out there, lots of correlates that have been identified for crime, and we want to be able to identify amongst those correlates, of course, which ones are the ones that are causes, because those are the ones, if we target, that we may be able to change, and by changing them, that may lead to us to be able to change that crime involvement and those patterns that we see. And one of the things that SAT is being successful in doing is identifying some of these factors that appear to be quite strong correlates, but also when we do further testing that we can try to assess whether they may actually be causes of crime. And those, of course, as I said earlier, from the personal characteristics, personal morality, the ability to exercise self-control, and then from places, it's the environmental features, which are aspects of the moral context, the rules that apply to a setting, and the level at which they are being enforced. And another important question these analyses support within SAT is this explanation of why. Why are these characteristics relevant? Why are people and settings with these characteristics the ones that we want to look at? And that's because of the perception choice process, because these characteristics lead people in these contexts to see crime as an option and then to choose it as an action. So this is all encompassed within that PEA model that I showed you earlier. The next step, of course, is try to answer the how questions. How do people get these propensities? How do settings emerge that have these environmental features? How do these people with these crime propensities end up in these settings? And that's leading us back to the DEA model. So that's leading us back to look at these psychosocial processes and these socio-ecological processes. And of course, the follow-on question of that is, how do we change propensity? How do we change this exposure? And by doing so, how do we change crime? And that will be the next step that we look at, and I will turn it over to my colleague Gabriela to talk to you about that. So thank you for your attention. I think now, if you have any technical questions, you can ask me, but then we'll save all questions for myself and Gabriela to after. Is there anything I can clarify? Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to have you all here. I'm Gabriela. I'm also part of the PADS team. And I'm going to just jump straight into it and continue where Carl has left off. And where she's left it off is that according to the SAT, the situation is the appropriate level to analyze and explain acts of crime. Does this mean that social factors are not important? No, it does not. Social factors are important, but they should be treated as causes of the causes and not causes of crime. And this is really where the main important aspect is, that maybe some things that we now see as risk factors are related to crime, but they do not cause crime. The causes of crime, at least according to the SAT, are propensity and exposure, which then converge to lead to acts of crime. So, according to the SAT, acts of crime are a consequence of the convergence between specific kinds of people and specific kinds of places. But if we deconstruct this, we then have kinds of places and kinds of people. And of course, the question is, who are these people? And what do these places look like that together create situations conducive of crime? So, to understand this, we have to look at processes of personal and social emergence, how people become who they are, and how settings become more criminogenic in nature. And for example, personal history matters. We don't develop in a void, we develop in the context of our families, our schools, our peer networks, our cultural setting, our social class milieu, and a few other things that are all important. So, what I'm going to look at is what are the factors that influence the development of propensity and exposure over time? What makes people who they are? And how do places become more criminogenic? So the main research question for this talk is, what role does the context of the family and school in childhood play in setting people off on trajectories of specific levels of propensity and exposure through the entire period of adolescence and early adulthood? So the keywords here are, the social factors are taken from childhood, but they predict entire trajectories of propensity and exposure over time. So in order to look at these family and school environments, what we've done is we've used data from the parent interview, which was collected when children were aged 12. And we had quite rich data, both retrospectively on how children developed, but also how they were at age 12. And we used a few, we did factor analysis, and we obtained several second-order factors. One we labeled family closeness. This was composed of 3 subscales representing parent-child interaction quality, family cohesion, and the parental affection towards the child. So how much you miss your child when your child is away, how much you love your child, etc. Then we had a factor that we labeled good parenting, or parenting skills. And this comprised having more organized activities like going to drama classes or not spending too much time playing video games, having a good nutrition, so poor nutrition would be skipping breakfast and having sweets and going to McDonald's, and having a good parental monitoring. And then we also had a factor which we labeled supportive school, but bear in mind that it actually represents the parent's opinion on the school and the teachers, and the parent's opinion on what the child thinks of the school and the teachers. So these were the 3 factors in childhood that we considered. And we went back to our trajectories of propensity and exposure. And as Kyle has already presented, we revealed, or we discovered that there were 3 types of trajectories of propensity and 2 main types of trajectories of exposure. So we used these as outcome variables. Therefore, these 2 variables referring to propensity represent the likelihood of following a trajectory of high propensity, which could range from 0% to 100% likelihood. And for exposure, we had an indicator representing the likelihood of following a trajectory of high exposure. For our predictors, we had family closeness, good parenting, and supportive school, which were mildly positively related as we would expect. And this was all done in the context of path analysis. So to look at these relationships, we took each of them in turn, and we found that lower levels of family closeness were related to a higher likelihood of following a trajectory of heightened propensity. Then we found that lower levels of good parenting were both more conducive of trajectories of high propensity and high exposure. And similarly, lower supportive school environments were conducive of heightened trajectories of both propensity and exposure. So this was interesting, but then we felt we need to press on and deconstruct propensity and exposure further, because they are both quite complex dimensions. So for example, propensity is composed both of weak, low relevant morality and a poor generalized ability to exercise self-control, and these are 2 fairly different things. Similarly, criminogenic exposure is composed of exposure to criminogenic settings, but also exposure to crime-prone peers. So, of course, we would think that these being fairly different constructs, which might develop differently throughout the period of adolescence, the mechanisms that underlie the relationship between these parenting and school environments and these trajectories could differ for these different subconstructs. So, of course, this kind of makes sense because if you take, for example, morality, morality is proposed by the SAT to develop in the context of moral education. Children and young adults receive moral education through instruction or by observing how other people behave in morally ambiguous situations, and or also by trial and error. They then evaluate this through their internal processing mechanisms, and then they end up internalizing their own configuration of moral rules. For self-control, however, the processes are quite different. So self-control develops in the context of cognitive nurturing. This takes place when children and young adults have the opportunities to exercise self-control. The more opportunities to exercise self-control, the better you might become at it. However, you don't necessarily become at it better just by doing it. It depends on the development and potentiation of specific neural pathways that become reinforced every time you exercise self-control. And in the end, this increases your ability for self-control. So because these processes develop differently, of course, it begs the question, will family and school environments influence these developments differently? But before we even did that, we first wanted to find out whether trajectories of morality and self-control match the overall trajectory of propensity that we have already found, and whether trajectories of exposure to criminogenic settings and to crime-prone peers match the overall trajectory of criminogenic exposure that we have already found. So for crime propensity, as Kyle has presented, the overall trajectory looks like this. It is a piecewise growth model which peaks at age 16. So people's propensity increases and then decreases in the later part of adolescence. For morality and self-control, it looks like that. For morality, so bear in mind that because we wanted them to be in the same direction as propensity, when you see morality and self-control increasing, that means they become worse. So they both show the peak at around the age of 15 or 16. Morality became much worse to the age of 16, but then it became slightly better over time. Of course, it makes sense because children become more and more autonomous, and this is a period of identity formation, so this is the period when they will explore. For self-control, it also makes sense because we know that the development of the prefrontal cortex, where self-control and executive functions are seated, has two big growth spurts. One is in toddlerhood, so ages 2 to 3, when children start learning how to regulate their emotions. But the second big growth spurt in these neural pathways is in this second part of adolescence. So what we found is very much in line with literature from psychology and neurocriminology. When we looked at how many different types of trajectories of morality and self-control there are, we found 3 in each case. This was the best fitting model. And they match both the overall crime propensity trajectories, but also the mean of each of these 2 subconstructs. For criminogenic exposure, the average trajectory looked like this. And when we looked separately for settings and crime-prone peers, we discovered a similar peak at age 16. I think this makes sense particularly in the UK context, because at age 16, children sit their GCSE exams, and this is the time when compulsory education finishes. So therefore, after the age of 16, their paths diverge quite a lot. Maybe they start engaging more with school if they want to continue on to go to university. And in fact, I should note here that even though we talk about types of trajectories, individual trajectories varied a lot, which is actually very interesting. So when we looked at types of trajectories of criminogenic exposure, as Carl presented earlier, we had 2 types. And when we looked at it for the different subconstructs, we once again found that the model with 2 types of trajectories fitted the data best for both settings and peers. So this was quite interesting, the fact that each of these subconstructs, much as they are quite different, they match the overall construct in terms of trajectories over time. So having discovered this, we moved on to ask our research question once more, which is, how do family and school environments in childhood influence the development of propensity and exposure when you deconstruct it by its subcomponents? So we went back and did some path analyses. In this case, the outcome variables were the likelihood of following a trajectory of weak morality and poor self-control, medium morality and medium self-control, and heightened exposure to criminogenic settings, as well as heightened exposure to crime-prone peers. The predictors were family closeness, good parenting, and supportive school at age 12. And what we found was that lower family closeness was related to a higher likelihood of following a trajectory of medium morality. Good parenting, actually poor parenting, let's say, was related to a higher likelihood of following a trajectory of a very weak morality and very poor self-control, as well as trajectories of heightened exposure to both settings and peers that are crime-prone. In terms of supportive schools, we found a similar pattern. Low supportive schools were related to a higher likelihood of following both trajectories of very weak morality and poor self-control, but also very high exposure to criminogenic settings and crime-prone peers. So if we go back and we put these analyses side by side, we would have on the top the analysis where we do not deconstruct propensity and exposure, and on the bottom the part where we actually look at morality, self-control, settings, and peers separately. And we have our factors. So we found that good parenting was related to heightened propensity and heightened exposure, and this was reflected when we looked separately by subcomponents. We found that low supportive schools was related to heightened trajectories of propensity and exposure, and the results held for each of their subcomponents as well. And for family closeness, we found that when we have an overall model, higher family closeness is related to a lower likelihood of following a trajectory of heightened propensity, but to a lower likelihood of following a trajectory of medium morality. So these results look like they might contradict each other a little bit, but I would be very wary to draw that conclusion because you see there's only one little star there. Those results were very marginally significant. And of course, it begs the question, why? Does family closeness maybe not play a role? But of course, it may be, so just purely speculating, it could be that in families with high closeness, the morality of the parents more strongly translates to the child. So therefore, closeness might, if closeness is high in families with low morality, maybe this is what is transmitted. And if closeness is high in families with high morality, maybe that is what is transmitted. So therefore, these analyses deserve maybe a further insight and further analysis into how it relates to also morality of the family. To sum up, we have 3 key findings. The first one is that parenting skills and the school context in childhood is important not just for propensity and exposure per se, but for their development throughout adolescence. So it predicts entire trajectories. It sets people off on specific types of trajectories over time. The second important point is that, quite specifically, it's low levels of parenting and poor school environments that are related to quite high propensity and quite high exposure. And the third important point is that these results hold when propensity and exposure are taken by their subcomponents, namely morality, self-control, exposure to criminogenic settings, and to crime-prone peers. So, to look at this a bit further, the question that arises is, Well, we've looked at family and school environments in childhood, but what about changes in family environments? And what about changes in school environments? And of course, there are other things that we did not consider, like the cultural setting and so on. So we are doing that right now. Actually, this is work in progress. We are looking at how changes in family and school environments over this period of adolescence might translate into changes of trajectories over time. This is very exciting work. The other question that is, of course, relevant is, what about crime? I have not mentioned crime maybe a single time in this talk. But Kyle has shown that trajectories of heightened propensity and heightened exposure translate into trajectories of high crime or persistent crime. So this point I'm not going to touch upon because it will actually be discussed in depth by Per-Olof Wikström in the lecture of the prize winners a bit later today. And at that point, you will get the full picture of how family and school environments might or might not translate into heightened crime over time through their influence on trajectories of propensity and exposure. And he will also discuss this in the broader context of social disadvantage. So I'm going to leave you with this. Thank you very much for coming, and I hope you've enjoyed it so far.
Any questions for Gabriela or Roxanne?
Good. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Two great presentations. We're now going to switch across the pond and discuss a bit on an ongoing project in Chicago. And it's part of a larger set of studies, actually, that's in progress that builds on the project in human development in Chicago neighborhoods, which has been ongoing for a while. This is a working paper. There's several others. Again, it's part of a larger group, and I'm happy offline to send folks material if you're interested. So in this particular presentation, what I want to do is to, first of all, consistent with the title, make a sharp distinction between crime and criminalization. Criminalization referring to state control, arrest, supervision, incarceration. Particularly in the United States, we've seen a sharp change in the response of the state to crime. This is well known, often referred to as mass incarceration. In the United States, for example, the rate of imprisonment went up 5-fold to where we're now the world's leader in criminalization in that particular respect. And importantly, and unlike crime, this is an interesting contrast to, for example, what Kyle said about the commission of crime among kids. In the United States, criminalization, at least for certain segments, has become a normal part of the life course. This is a radical shift, so we really have to theorize and understand criminalization. Just one quick example, among black men with lack of high school education, about 70% can expect to spend time in prison. So that is, in fact, not a small group. And for certain groups, the fact that it's a normal part of the life course is not just shocking, it demands explanation. So what I'm going to do is work through some investigation of this particular issue. Now, on mass incarceration, I think the primary response in the United States, but also I think even internationally, has been to look at the effects of mass incarceration, and naturally so. There's a lot of reason to believe that this has had negative effects on society. But, although this is crucial, it begs the input question. This is where it's going to become consistent with the earlier presentations, that the process of becoming criminalized itself is kind of left to the side. And that's a problem, especially among children of the prison boom. That is to say, the children that are coming of age during this period of mass incarceration, we don't know a lot about the effects on them, even if we are going to study the effects of mass incarceration, and the course of their criminalization. So what I'm going to argue here, basically, is kind of simple, is that the sociology of punishment
theorists of punishment need life course criminology. Because what we know from life course criminology is that criminal behavior tends to have early onset. We've just seen that. And the theories, I think, from life course criminology are quite relevant. These two need to be joined in ways that haven't been done. So that's what I'm going to do. And the theoretical argument is that criminalization is, in fact, a process, that it unfolds over time, similar to criminal behavior. Okay. Okay. Can everyone hear? Okay, great. I'll talk louder. Stand what? Stand still there. Still? Oh, no, I don't like to do that. I lack self-control. So criminalization is a process, and you can further argue that it can be conceived as a fundamental turning point, right? It has a distinct timing. One is arrested at a particular point in time. It has a sense in which we can think of this as a snare or as a negative turning point, and therefore the timing and early process is important. I'm also going to look at the family context, consistent with the theme of this particular meeting and some of the work of the prize winners, not just P.O., but Travis and Kathy Whitman, all looking at the family context. So I'm going to ask how that family context is important, both with regard to potential mediating dimensions of informal social control, but again, the distinction and therefore official labeling. And so I'm really interested in intergenerational processes. That's really what this is all about. And this is a sketch, I'll go through it pretty quickly, of the intergenerational processes of criminalization. There's a lot of other aspects, but I'm going to focus here on key aspects of the family, including economic instability, low education, some of the more traditional correlates, structural features of families, single-parent households, housing instability, and this was consistent with earlier presentation by both Kyle and Gabriela on family. I think of it as relational controls, informal social control, supervision, because supervision and control of children's activity, particularly in public spaces, is relevant to interaction with the state, with other authorities, which then brings one under the purview of potential arrest. But I think a key aspect here is parental incarceration, parental criminalization, in the extent to which it affects children's lives. Now, the more traditional way to think about it is kind of graphed here, right? Which is, well, criminal parents raise kids, perhaps, in ways that are not so great, and they themselves are a criminal. That is, child behavior is mediating the relationship between parental characteristics and persistent criminalization as an adult, or the pathway to early criminalization. But these yellow arrows are quite interesting theoretically. They suggest a distinct role for parental criminalization, or the intergenerational process of criminalization, in several ways, actually. One is the extent to which it's affecting the timing of early arrest. Secondly, the persistence of criminalization over time. And thirdly, the extent to which it actually interacts with behavior. I'm not going to have much time to get into this today, but there's evidence that the conversion, if you will, of behavior into criminalization interacts with context. And one of the key features of this context, I think, is the parental criminalization. So that's just a rough sketch overview. I'll come back to this at the end. So the setting for this study is the Project in Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods. This started a while back. This is a large study. Started in data collection started about 1995. Planning started a bit earlier. It's a very large study, about 6,200 children, 3 waves of data collection from a birth cohort up to later adolescent cohorts, sequential cohort design. It also was embedded in a neighborhood study, which also had a longitudinal component with independent measurement and data analysis. There's been a lot of articles written on this. These data are public. I also presented a lot of the results of this particular project in Great American City, Chicago, and the enduring neighborhood effect. But what I want to do is now, we're in the new phase, we're moving on. And in the last several years, as part of a larger project, I've been involved with a follow-up. So I'd like to, in a way, introduce, particularly an international audience, wave 4 of PHDCN. This is part of, again, I'm not going to talk about it, but it's part of another project called the Mixed Income Project, which we use the acronym MIP, that involves both Chicago and Los Angeles. People said, well, Chicago, what about other cities, Chicago's different, da-da-da-da. Yeah, it's different, so we're studying it. And that's part of also a longitudinal project, but I'm just going to set that aside and focus on the Chicago part. We didn't follow all the cohorts, go back to them. It's a huge study, particularly in the United States, very large country. People have moved all over the world, actually, so it's really tough to find people. It's also been 12 years approximately since they were last contacted. So this was a major effort, took several years. The original data collection had a very high, good response rate for the United States, and we're very happy with our response rate for the follow-up. For the birth cohorts, about 67%. We've done detailed analyses of attrition. We've modeled that. It's in the analysis. I'm not going to get into the details of the statistical model for attrition bias, but it's there. I can tell you offline. What we did is to select, theoretically, 4 cohorts. The birth cohort, which, as you know, in criminology, there are very few birth cohorts, sociology, social sciences in general, age 9, age 12, and age 15. The idea was to get adolescents and infancy, and then follow them out. It's a very diverse sample, representative of children in Chicago living in that time, predominantly Latino, Black, and white. We followed their residential histories over the complete period of time. Also, just completed the end of last year, the criminal history project, and this is important for the criminal history part. So, oops, did I go? I'm going to use yeah, it does work, Kyle. Go back. So the Criminal History Project is essentially all contacts at the repository in Illinois. Now, why Illinois? Well, because in the United States, we don't have a national database at the individual level that's easily accessible. Fortunately, about 90% of our sample remained in the Illinois area. So this is restricted to that 90%, so we're getting the vast majority. This goes all jurisdictions. We use matching software to identify our kids, which I don't get into the details here, but the accuracy is very high. As you can see here, it was more than 80% of the matches were a probability of 100%, over 90%, 99%, very accurate matching. So we have individual records of every single contact, arrest, the timing, disposition, sentencing, incarceration, and so forth. So the benefits, quickly, before I get into some of the results, is, first of all, this is a representative sample. And this is important for criminalization, because there's tons of studies looking at sentencing and so forth, or police-citizen encounters, but they're all conditioned on the criminal justice contact, which theoretically is not what we want. We want a population sample. Secondly, it's long-term data coverage. This is 20 years now in an important historical era. Importantly, this is the era of mass incarceration. This is the first cohort, really, that has grown up within that context. There's been intergenerational studies of prior cohorts in other countries. A rich measurement across multiple domains. We've now linked it with the official histories. It's also got a contextual multi-level design, which I won't get into much today. And finally, this sequential cohort starting with birth. And it looks like this. And I put this up so that you can really see the historical context within which these kids are growing up. So the birth cohort is coming of age in an interesting time. The crime rate is just starting to decline. In fact, we didn't know this, but basically the year that we enrolled our birth cohort was about the first year in Chicago that the violence rate started to plummet. And it kept going down and then leveled off. The 9, 12, and 15-year-old cohorts, a very different historical circumstance. They grew up or spent their young childhood years in the peak of violence in Chicago. if exposure to violence as a child is important, and we think it is, and there's evidence to suggest it is from many other studies, then this is crucially important, and it suggests that these cohorts are experiencing totally different worlds. So I think this shows, at least theoretically, the importance of a cohort design, and we're looking at this in other papers. What I'd like you to just think about is the cohort differences and the vast social changes in America that have unfolded in A, rise and fall of violence, in rise in mass incarceration. And you can see that this is what our kids experienced in adolescence, a stable regime of high control. Again, I mean, we didn't, this is ironic, we didn't know any of this, but basically in 1995 it hit near the peak and is just stable throughout. So this is the context within which our kids are growing up. Okay, there's the backdrop. Now, the methods are driven by the substance here. I'm going to look at two methods. We have some simpler methods, although these are actually pretty simple. Survival analysis, which hasn't actually been used a lot. It's very important, in my view, because it's capturing the timing of the event. In this case, the timing of first incarceration. And secondly, semi-parametric group-based trajectory models. Some of you may find that ironic. I've criticized these models some in the past, but they are, I think, important in distinguishing whether or not there is heterogeneity, and particularly in the high-rate group. I'm less interested in how many groups. I think that debate is kind of stale. But I think that getting to the identification of persistent high-rate groups is important. And I'm going to focus here then on the hazard of first criminalization and the persistence of official criminalization. Okay, first, just to show you the data are good, there is an age crime curve. And it's basically classically perfect. Travis would like this. Right? This is all arrests, individual over time, and you can see that it peaks and goes down just like it should. Over 2,000 events are generated by our kids. Okay, but now what happens when we start to break this down? This is, I'm going to look at the survival times, give you a little descriptive analysis, and then get to the punchline in terms of some of the consistent patterns here. So I'm going to look at the hazard estimate, which is essentially the instantaneous rate of first arrest, and I'll look at some Cox model, regression models that are modeling the time or survival to first arrest. Now, in terms of survival time, this is for overall arrests, and you can see the decline and the leveling off, and this is hard for me to read, this small screen here, but you can see that, and this is quite remarkable in some respects, this is for all cohorts by, well, at least by age 30, 40% had experienced an arrest. So this is not, right, a small thing. It is affecting a lot of kids. The hazard rate also follows the classic age crime curve. But in both cases, what you see is that the criminal trajectory for criminalization is set fairly early. So when we think about mass incarceration and the effects of mass incarceration, we cannot rule out children. We have to understand that early pathway into criminalization. Now, there's some interesting age period cohort analyses that we're doing. I'm just going to show you, there are cohort differences. So for example, you see the birth cohort, which is in red, and the cohort 9, they're both going up, but the 9-year-old cohort has a higher peak, going up sharper. And I showed you earlier that it lived through a very different historical circumstance, and we're breaking that down. But again, you can see interesting cohort differences. The older cohorts, of course, aren't observed earlier, their first entry into the system. We don't have data going back as far, but when you piece it together, what's nice about this is you do see the age crime curve, but you also see kind of some small cohort differences, but particularly for the birth cohort. Now, what about persistent criminalization? Briefly, this is a group-based trajectory model. And just to make this fast, investigated this. We can talk about the number of groups, but actually a two-group model fits the data really well. That is to say, I can find, you know, another group or two under that blue line, but it doesn't actually improve the fit much, and I think it's just noise for the most part, to be honest. And really what's going on here, it seems, is that the big difference is that it's a relatively low or non-arrest rate group, and one that's pretty high, but is declining after adolescence. So again, this goes back to the, you know, is there a life course persister? I like to think of these as high-rate groups because they are declining with age, or what we call life course desisters. And this is also true, I mean, you can see it in the birth cohort. You have this, if you just break it down, because we're only observing the birth cohort out to about 20, sharp going up. Now, what happens if we just look at the 9-year-old cohort? Again, 9 years later, very different, same exact pattern, but they're followed out later, goes down, but there is that high-rate group. So you really see the distinct group. So that's the analytic question now. You're going to see results now for A, the timing of criminalization, that is the hazards of first arrest, and then secondly, taking all arrests, that is these persistent arrests, those who are continually arrested throughout the life course that we're observing, those two different outcomes. One is a simple group model predicting trajectory group of high persistence, and the other is the timing. Finally, I want to show you that there are important racial disparities that, at least in the United States, are fundamental and cannot be ignored. And this is where you really see the fact that the prevalence is important. 40% of non-Hispanic blacks are arrested. And it comes to the older cohorts, stunningly, 80%. Okay, get that right. 80% of non-Hispanic blacks, as you can see, have failed, that is to say, have been arrested by age 30, about 60% of Latino Americans, and even 40% of white Americans. So this is not an abnormal, this is a normal part of the life course, unfortunately, in the United States. The group-based model, the persistent criminalization, it is a small group, but profoundly shaped by race. 5% of the birth cohort for whites is in the persistent adolescent high-rate group. 18% of blacks, threefold difference, almost no difference for whites and Latinos. For the 9-year-old cohort, 11% of whites, 35% of non-Hispanic blacks. 3-to-1 differential. So there's sharp differences here. Finally, sharp differences in exposure in terms of parental incarceration. This comes back to my point about the importance of looking at the context of growing up in households that are differentially criminalized. So for blacks, about 44% of the children have family members with police records, arrests. 29% of whites, 30% of Hispanics. Jail and prison, 20%. So 1 out of every 5 of our kids have parents that are incarcerated. A parent, not both parents, a family member, compared to 5% of whites, 3% of Hispanics. And then as you go into waves 2 and 3, 30% of African Americans and 29% of African Americans at wave 3 had someone that entered into jail or prison within that wave period. So again, profound differences. Okay, so that's the backdrop, and now let me quickly just give you a feel for some of the results and then sum up with, I think, some theoretical implications. First, if we do a proportional hazards model of that risk of first arrest, we see, just doing a basic demographic model, that there are large race and gender differences, which we totally expect based on the descriptive data, but also prior research. Males have a much higher odds, and African Americans compared to whites. However, and this might be a little hard to read, but when we do a fuller model that brings into account the theoretically relevant characteristics, we see, first of all, that the race differences are no longer significant. They are explained, which is important because you saw how large they were, by the model. First of all, generational status is incredibly important in the United States. first and second generation kids, particularly in the older cohort, have lower probabilities of incarceration. Single parent and cohabiting, actually, at least in the birth cohort, have higher risk compared to married parent families. But importantly, and I can talk about these other factors, these two arrows I want to bring your attention to, these are what we might think of as the crime path and the intergenerational criminalization path. We've measured in both the birth cohort, because there were later follow-ups through the CBCL, the Child Behavior Checklist, which is sort of the gold standard of measuring aggressive behavior. We also measured anxiety and depression and self-control in the kids. They don't matter in this particular analysis. I can show you more on that. But the aggressive behavior of the child is, and we would expect it to be, right? It would be a totally irrational world, I suppose, if it was not related to the hazards of arrest, and it is. But there's also a path, particularly for the 9-year-old cohort. There's some evidence the coefficient is positive, not quite significant for the birth cohort. There's some evidence that if we look at just prison, that is having a parent in prison, there is some evidence for the birth cohort. But right now I'm focusing on the total number of family members with a criminal record. It has a direct link to the criminalization for the 9-year-old cohort. Let me play that out a little bit more, because you're probably thinking of, well, there's confounders here. Yes, we can deal with them, I think at least arguably. One is, as I've just noted, individual behavior. But the richness of the PHDCN allows us to measure individual behavior both through self-reports for the older cohorts and parental reports through the CBCL. So we've done that: aggression, delinquency, drugs and alcohol. And then again, the full CBCL measure, self-reports on the part of the kid. The second is interactions with the police. Well, it may just be that certain kids are more likely to come in contact with the police. And fortunately, in the self-report instrument, we know, because the kids were asked if, when they were talking about their self-reported activities, if they had talked with the police or there was any interaction with the police for that particular encounter. So we have an indicator of the actual exposure to police. Institutionally, we also have potential proactive police practices, right? This is a big debate in the United States. Aggressive policing. We actually then went out and collected these data. So I don't have time to get into the detail, but this takes into account the ratio of all arrests of not just a residents of the area in which the child lives, but also incidents that occur there, even if people are coming from outside. So it's sort of the intensity of police surveillance of that area, plus the ratio of what some would refer to as non-serious offense to serious offenses, which is often used as an indicator of proactive policing. And we know in the United States, or at least there's evidence or argument, that the composition of the neighborhood is relevant with regard to policing practices, particularly racial composition, over-policing of high minority neighborhoods, and secondly, high poverty neighborhoods. We've measured that. We have that for each wave of the child. So all these things are taken into account in the particular model we're looking at. Another risk factor, if you will, and this is, I think, one of the biggest ones that comes up is like, well, okay, the families are incarcerated, but these are just, these are troubled people in certain respects, right? The families, there's domestic violence, there's trouble. Well, we are able to tap into that in many different ways. I won't go into all the details, but in addition to exposure to violence, the extent of violence, drinking in the family, the extent to which families are getting in trouble with institutions, jobs, schools, even trouble with the police, absent of getting arrested. In other words, there's a lot of families that are, I'm thinking of it again as troubled, where there's interactions with authorities, with housing authorities, with the police, with employers. They're getting fired, alcohol, drug treatment, even suicide attempts, and treatment for alcoholism, treatment for drugs. So So we have a whole assessment on that. The important thing is that, yes, these things tend to kind of cluster together as we would expect from a lot of developmental research among adults, but the response to that is distinct. And the response to that is actually also distinct by race. So it actually turns out in the United States, but this is, I think, consistent with prior research, that trouble with drugs, for example, even treatment for drugs and alcohol, is higher among whites, that is, the white caretakers of our children, than African Americans. But the official responses in terms of arrest are, as you saw, double, triple. So they go together, but there's distinct reality to official criminalization. And finally, I'm arguing that the criminalization itself, and this is bringing social control theory in the classic way into the fold, but in a slightly different way. That is to say, supervision and family control is an important factor, I believe, and I've always argued this in life course research, for the behavior of the child, and we've seen this in the earlier presentations, for the behavior of the child in terms of crime, but it's also important for responses. For one thing, and research on the police shows this, that the extent to which, for example, family support, where the court or the police think that the parents are out of control or can be a sponsor for the child, is a factor in whether or not they're arrested and treated, and also supervision, as I said, the regulation of public space. Okay, so I'm almost out of time, so I'll show you I'm just going to show you one result here, I think, for the 9-year-old cohort. This brings everything into play, and I'm showing you here the persistent criminalization group. Again, this is persistent criminalization arrest for the 9-year-old cohort. It's a relatively simple model. This is weighted again for attrition and sampling representative of the population. These are odds ratios shown in a simple way, hopefully. Police interactions, criminal justice intensity, aggressive behavior, self-reported delinquency, family social support ties, family social control, behavioral troubles, and family members with a criminal record. What's in red is what is actually predictive here, and consistent with what we would expect, the kids that are high behavioral aggressive or delinquent via self-report. The aggressive behavior, as you saw, was important for the timing. For the persistence, it was really the consistency of self-reported delinquency. It's a significant predictor. But more so, family control's direct negative effect, and family members with a criminal record has this persistent and continuing effect. So I want to go back to the model that I proposed earlier and want to think through this a little bit more in conclusion. So what I think is going on here, and maybe calls for reorientation for how we think about incarceration. We talk a lot about reentry, right, of offenders into the population, especially with what we hope is the end of mass incarceration as it tends to plateau and decline. But consistent with life course criminology, we really need to pay attention to what I would think of here as pre-entry or pre-entry family context, and the crucial importance of the family context in terms of stability, education, troubles with the criminal justice system, particularly incarceration, and this direct link that we've seen that goes to early criminalization, that also goes to persistent criminalization over the life course. Now, if you think about this, again, going back to where I started, I argued that mass incarceration was looking at the effects. Now, in a way, I'm looking at the effects here, but it's the effects on the children of the prison boom. And this is one of the first studies where the children are now old enough to have experienced the effects of this large-scale experiment that was engaged in our country, but also some others. And it seems to be problematic, consistent effects, but consistent with a life course longitudinal effect. We can think of this really perhaps more realistically as the intergenerational reproduction, because people do come out of prison, and guess what? our kids, when they come out, or even if they don't come out, are the parents, will become the parents of the next generation, okay? Which means then that this process has a reciprocal feedback loop, and then the intergenerational process is set in motion again. So that is a deeper issue that really calls for, and I don't have the answers, some serious policy or hard thinking about criminalization itself. And we always talk about focusing on children, and I believe that's certainly important. But again, the older, let's say the adolescents who have already experienced this, they are also relevant to children because, again, I want to emphasize that, they are the potential parents of these children, and to the extent that the behavior of the family and the intergenerational criminalization effects are big, that means we cannot ignore that generation either. So while it's never too early, it's never too late, of course, is one of the themes that's also important for criminalization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Rick Saar from Australia. A question for Robert before he leaves the podium. And it's really just tying two themes together, which I think you came to right at the end of the talk. It's always been my view that, and it's been a mantra for a long time, that the greatest predictor of a young person's trajectory into a life course of adult crime is the extent and the intensity with which the justice system responds to their first activity or first exposure to criminal activity. In the earlier part of your talk, you indicated the inevitable trajectory down, notwithstanding one's first arrest. And one might take heart if one were a police officer or a criminal justice advocate that the inevitability of that trajectory meant that the early exposure to arrest and potentially to short-term incarceration was not going to have that inevitability. At the end of the talk, you then talked about the intensity and the criminalisation, the incarceration, as having an ongoing effect on that next generation. So I suppose I'm caught in a dilemma about the extent to which one should or should not worry too much about the intensity of the first criminal justice interaction to a 16 or 17-year-old. I'd like to hear from you that it actually does make an incredible difference, and the extent to which we have attempted diversionary activities is important. But your trajectory away and heavily down to one at 23 and 24 worries me. I was less worried when you said actually persistent criminalisation and incarceration does have this effect. So tell me, what should I be believing?
Yeah, so great question, great question. I think, let's see. So, see if I can do this. And maybe go back. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think there's sorry. I don't think there's a tension there so much in a couple ways. First of all, I don't think I use the phrase inevitable for the trajectories. That's one of my...
I saw it going this way.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, that's one of my critiques of the trajectory modeling in the past, because it tends to sort of infer that, and I'm going to try to go back to that. Oh, geez. I think that they are showing... Yeah, here we go. Yeah, that's good enough. So, I mean, first of all, in the period of about 15 to 25, if you were just to take that slice, it's pretty flat, right? I mean, it's not going down until later. And that's a long period of time that there's consistent arrest. And this is just arrest. I'm not even looking at incarceration. And I showed you earlier, and so that's why I agree that this is crucially important. When you're seeing 60% of population, or a subgroup of population, incarcerated, which has, you know, distinct sharp effects, then I think one does need to be quite worried. So I view this more as not so much, it's, you know, it's increasing here, declining here, is that this is the group that is persistently being arrested, and the life course consequences of that, I think, are profound. And there's evidence, including some in the Chicago data by Dave Kirk and Akiva Lieberman, published in Criminology not too long ago, that the first arrest itself increases the probability of another arrest. And that's independent of all the research on the fact that, you know, jobs and, you know, searching the criminal records in terms of any number of things, housing vouchers, employment, and so forth, are affected. So I wouldn't use and don't use the idea of inevitability. I just view this as saying, statistically, this is one way to capture the group, or the set of individuals, really. It's not even a group. It's a set of individuals in our data that have very persistently high rates of arrest, and that's it, and the distinction of that. So I totally agree with you, and I don't see them as contradictory at all. And I'm very worried, particularly, it's not just the intergenerational piece. I've kind of assuming, again, there's been a lot of good research on mass incarceration and the effects of a criminal record. My colleague Diva Pager has shown this using random experimental audit studies. That this is, you know, the science is pretty strong on the direct effect of the record itself. What I'm arguing is that that brackets getting, you know, the record. In other words, we need the pathways into that and not just criminal behavior, because they are distinct. And again, you know, criminology historically had a sharp difference in theorizing about this, the traditional labeling theory and traditional criminological theory. I think that distinction has gotten a bit lost, and crime events are kind of used, arrests are kind of used as an indicator of crime, and it's kind of a mush. And I'm trying to show that these processes have just, in part, similar, but also in part distinct etiological pathways.
I have a question for all panel members about something I've noticed in both studies, and it's to do with the content of the moral context of the family for development. Rob, you've talked about growing up in a family where a family member has had a criminal record or an incarceration, and to me that seems to be related pretty strongly to the moral context of the family development there. And Gabriela was talking about how family closeness is an interesting one, because family closeness can impact on moral development in either direction. If the moral context is weak, it can encourage that development as well as if it's strong. So I was interested to hear a bit more about how in both studies your capacity with the data, but also your plans and thoughts on future analysis of the nature and the content of the moral context of the family for development.
Well, I can speak from the PAD study. This is actually one of the things that we're trying to explore right now. So in the original text, Wikström et al. 2012, Breaking Rules, we're looking at the situation and trying to understand what kinds of contexts lead people to commit crime, and that's how we've come to the exposure variable that both Gabriela and I have used today. Now we're trying to understand about these developmental contexts, and those include both the school context, what aspects of the school context are relevant for moral education and cognitive nurturing, and also for selection effects into these kinds of developmental contexts. And then also there's the family context as well. And this is something we're certainly using a lot of the work by Rob and others, looking at life events, experiences, over the life course that the family can have. So we're trying to really focus in on those concepts, the concepts of moral education, the concepts of cognitive nurturing, the concept of social and self-selection, because that helps guide us in thinking about what factors of those types of settings will be relevant. But this is ongoing work, as you know. So.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I would answer in two respects. One, consistent, I think, with what Kyle said. I think looking at how the context of the family is influencing the, I call it self-control, morality, character of the child. There's a big debate going on right now outside of criminology and economics and human capital skill development. Jim Heckman, of economics, Nobel Prize, variety, has talked about cognitive and non-cognitive skills and character. So there's a behavioral component to it, and there's also a cognitive component to it. And I recently wrote an article, essay on that, arguing that, calling it the characterological imperative, that the emphasis on character is important, but the context of character development has been underplayed. So in economics, it's more about decisions and choices, and in psychology, it's about individual differences and neurobiology even. But the context, environments where kids are growing up, family violence, exposure to violence in the community, is critically important. It has effects on both cognitive development, including test scores among kids, good evidence on this, and also non-cognitive skills in terms of behavior and self-control, so forth. So I do think we have to take those into account. But secondly, and maybe more radically, I would also say that for the criminalization part that I'm talking about, I would question the moral context of the institutions. So for me, the morality, I think, is misplaced if we are just looking at the individual, right? That the morality of the incarceration differences and the fivefold increase, conditional on basically the same behaviors as a policy choice that was made in the United States, that macro social change, that historical event which transformed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people, and it's seen in our data at the individual level, that to me is not something that can be understood at the level of the individual. If we want to bring morality into it, I think we have to bring to play the morality of our criminal justice institutions.
I'll just follow on that really quickly because it's a great point, and it actually brings back to something Gabriela said, which was where she emphasized the importance of the moral context in relation to law-relevant morality. So when we talk about the moral context, SAT is not a moralistic framework. It's about what the rules are and how they're enforced. And this is absolutely very interesting in thinking about these developmental contexts, because they may be supporting a morality that is not consistent with the law or with other kinds of social norms. And that is interesting, and that helps us understand how those contexts are actually influencing people's action as well as their development. So I'm in complete agreement with Rob on that.
Can I just quickly continue on that for a little bit? I think from this point of view, it's also quite important to consider what is adaptive in a specific kind of setting. So for example, there's some research in psychology that shows that mothers of 4-year-old little girls teach them to be more aggressive. So actively teach them to be more aggressive if they come from environments of very high stress. So I mean dangerous neighborhoods. And in that context, maybe that is adaptive or protective for their little girls, and it wouldn't be maybe in our middle-class neighborhoods. So maybe it is extremely important to not talk about this in absolute terms, but as Kyle mentioned, and as SAT actually defines it, to refer to things as deviation from the norms, but then these norms might be different in different cultures or different settings. So yeah, thanks.
Did you have one first? Yeah? Here, what's yeah, I'll see you.
So I had a question for Rob about the effect of parents' arrest records. Are you thinking of that in terms of the socialization effect through social control or social learning? Or are you thinking it more of as a stigma and a labeling effect?
Yeah, so good question. I didn't really have time to get into it. Both, actually. So I am trying to the best way I can, separate those. Now, the modeling, that's a little tricky in terms of how, socialization. But in terms of socialization, we do have all the traditional supervision and, scales of parental behavior that are traditionally used. We also have the parental behavior, the drug use, the alcohol use, and so on and so forth. So that, in a sense, was in the model. Now, what I was getting at was in trying to test, and I think it's not definitive, but I think there is evidence that the link is direct. Now, why? That's an institutional link, and I think it's in part because of stigma, although that's a little, fuzzy term. But the thing is, once parents are arrested, but it's not just parents, right? These are family members, brothers, uncles. You look in our data, it's amazing. You have kids who are growing up in an environment where it's not just the father, but the uncle, the older brother, and that's knowledge that's embedded in the criminal justice system that goes on. It retains over time. When the court is deciding, when even the arresting officers know, because these are circulating through the community, that knowledge is retained. And so I think that is important, because then that child is assumed to be part of a criminal family. So to me, theoretically, that makes perfect sense. And so I think that it's part stigma, it's part official record keeping. The other thing is, and we're trying to play this out, is that criminalization in the family, I think, also is kind of a driver of kids, sort of the chaotic nature of life in the family. And perhaps, I'm going to try to test this, leading to running away and homelessness and so forth, that escaping that environment, because it is a high stress environment. But I was referring to that sort of direct link. I didn't use the term stigma. I think it's appropriate, although there's a lot of baggage associated with stigma. I think the official record-keeping part, and just the assumptions that decision makers are making based on the fact that there is this historical family record. Even in criminology, we say, crime runs in the family, right? Well, that's kind of, yeah, it's true, but it's a little weird if you think about it. When you're an actor in the system, if you believe that, then you're more likely to make a harsher decision, or some kind of punitive decision in many respects, for that kid if they, quote, come from a family of crime.